Have mercy, O Lord, on our spiritual fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, and children, and save them, and by their holy prayers forgive us our transgressions. Have mercy, O Lord, on our parents, and save them, together with our brothers and sisters, our children, our relatives, and our friends. Grant them your blessing both here and in the life to come. Have mercy, O Lord, on the old and the young, the needy, the orphans, the widows, and all who are in sickness and sorrow, distress and affliction, oppression and captivity, in prison and confinement. Save them together with your servants who are under persecution for your sake and for the sake of the Orthodox faith. Remember them, visit them, strengthen and comfort them, and by your power grant them speedy relief, freedom, and deliverance. Have mercy, O Lord, on all who travel, and save all those who are sent on duty, our fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, and children, all our loved ones, and all Orthodox Christians. Have mercy, O Lord, on our enemies, save all who envy us, wish us evil, or deal unjustly with us. May they not perish because of us sinners. Enlighten, O Lord, with the truth of your holy wisdom all who have gone astray from the Orthodox faith, led by destructive heresies, and unite them once more to your holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church. Have mercy, O Lord, upon Loyola Marymount University, its faculty, staff, administration, and students. Bless the work of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute, and send your Holy Spirit upon the speakers and the guests, that they may all be guided by the light of your truth. Remember, O Lord, those who have departed this life, all Orthodox patriarchs, metropolitans, archbishops, bishops, and all who served you in the priesthood and ministry of the church and in the monastic order, and grant them rest with your saints in your eternal kingdom. Remember, O Lord, the souls of your servants now fallen asleep, our parents, family, and friends. Forgive them all their sins committed knowingly or unknowingly. Grant them your kingdom, a portion in your eternal blessing and the enjoyment of your unending life. Remember, O Lord, all who have fallen asleep in the hope of the resurrection and of eternal life, our fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, and children, all our loved ones and Orthodox Christians throughout the world. Place them with your saints before the lights of your countenance, and have mercy on us, for you are good and love humankind. O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth, faint-heartedness, lust of power, and thought. But give rather the spirit of chastity, humility, patience, and love to thy servant. Yea, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own errors, not to judge my brother, but allow her to bless him with your faith. Through the prayers of our holy fathers and mothers, Lord Jesus Christ our God, have mercy on us. Amen. O champion leader, to you I offer thanks of victory. O Theotokos, you have delivered me from terror, and as you have invincible
Before we start, I'm Michael Huffington. I haven't met all of you, and I've only met a few of you. But one of the reasons we started this institute was to bring all Christians together, starting with the Catholics and the Orthodox, but eventually Presbyterians, Lutherans, all Christians. And I thought this was beautiful, and I think it's wonderful to always have a prayer service before you start a conference like this, and it's something that Father has graciously done. But there was one sentence in here that I don't think is appropriate, and I think it's worthy of discussion. And I don't want anything to separate Christians. I want us to find avenues and bridges to come together. I was Presbyterian, I became Episcopalian, and then I became Orthodox. But something in here rubbed me the wrong way. It may or may not have affected you. But I think it's something that should be left out in the future, because only God is all-knowing. None of us as individuals are, and none of our individual churches are. And the line that I think was inappropriate was, "Enlighten us, O Lord, with the truth of your holy wisdom, all who have gone astray from the Orthodox faith." This is not an Orthodox university. This is not an Orthodox institute, nor is it a Catholic institute. It is a Catholic university. Led by destructive heresies, and unite them once more to your holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We want that. But every church, whether it's Catholic or Orthodox, believes in their truth. But what we're trying to do is find a bridge between those churches. So I would pray that we leave those words out, and we have another one. We can discuss this obviously afterwards. But one thing that I found, and if any of you who know who I am, there are no closets in my life. I bring all my friends together, young and old, Christian and atheist, gay and straight. And I think it's just imperative for this institute to be successful, for us to be open and communicative and speak what we believe is the truth. And we will have differences of opinions, and we should respect those opinions. But I didn't want to let that go without saying something, because it bothered me. And I believe in this institute. I believe in the leadership of this institute, and I'm very grateful to be a part of it. And I hope that we have a very successful 2 days. Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Mr. Huffington. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this event. He comes to us from St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, where he is Associate Professor in Systematic Theology and Director of Institutional Assessment. He is a graduate of St. Vladimir's Seminary and also Oxford University, having studied under Callistos Ware. His pedagogy and scholarship reveal a fascinating intersection of theology, patristics, spirituality, and ecclesiology. His dissertation was on the theological value of Christ's human soul in the Cappadocian Fathers, and his books and articles treat topics such as the World Council of Churches and the Orthodox Problem, ecumenical ecclesiology and the language of unity, and koinonia and Eucharistic unity, among dozens of other published works. His expertise on the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the other churches of Christianity is punctuated by his membership in the Faith and Order Commission of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the United States of America. In 2006, his book titled Sweeter Than Honey, Orthodox Thinking on Dogma and Truth was published by St. Vladimir Seminary Press, and he currently offers a podcast on the same topic on Ancient Faith Radio. Today, he will lecture on orthodoxy and ethnicity, making sense of the U.S. Orthodox landscape today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Butenyev.
Thank you, Deacon Nicholas. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It is a delight and an honor to participate in this event, this institute, and in this symposium. The work of Deacon Nicholas and his colleagues under the auspices of the university and the Huffington Ecumenical Institute, its board of advisors, its staff, and of course Mr. Huffington himself, is of inestimable importance in the life of the church and the churches. When it comes specifically to the Orthodox-Catholic relationship, it's become ever clearer over the past decades how important it is to maintain multiple channels of reflection and dialogue, local, national, international, formal, and informal. The official dialogues are, of course, crucial. There's no need to stress their significance and authority in the church, but the unofficial encounters and studies, precisely by virtue of being unofficial and unbinding, it is these that enjoy the intellectual and spiritual freedom that so often eludes the high-profile juggernaut of the international bilaterals. So the church needs this institute, and the church is grateful for it. I take note of the theme of this year's institute, that it focuses on the Orthodox churches, and I have to say I find it humbling in the North American context to have attention drawn to Orthodoxy. Numerically, we're such a small presence in America. I recall as a seminarian 25 years ago, I once asked a visiting priest, very active in the ecumenical movement, and I asked him, do the Orthodox get much attention in the ecumenical scene here? And his reply was, probably more than we deserve. And he meant this very seriously. And it wasn't either a joke or kind of a knee-jerk humility. It was a recognition of both the demographic realities, and Orthodoxy barely makes a dent in the religious landscape in North America, demographically speaking. And perhaps also he was referring to the character of our self-presentation, which can often, not always, thank God, but often be off-putting, condescending, and detached in the ecumenical sphere. So on one level, I would say it's true, we receive more attention than we deserve when it comes to our numbers and our personal silliness. Yet the Orthodox Church, as a theological, liturgical, spiritual reality, is undeniably worthy of every attention that you or I or anyone can give it. It means everything. You may think I'm talking about ideals versus realities. No, these are both realities, though in a different way. But when we talk of the true God-given glory of Orthodoxy, the fallenness of Orthodox Christians can't be ignored. As ever, we have this treasure in earthen vessels. And I think this is important to keep in mind because a lot of what concerns us here at this symposium, and specifically in my very broad and general talk this morning, is the matter of identity, self-concept, self-presentation. Who are we? Who am I? The old joke had it that if you asked that question of certain Russians, they would say, I am a Russian Orthodox Christian. Russian first, Orthodox second, and Christian last of all. And jokes, of course, sometimes tell the truth, partially at least. That self-presentation and self-concept can be contrasted to something that is no joke at all, namely what the late Metropolitan Anthony Bloom used to say frequently. He used to say, I never preach orthodoxy. I preach Jesus Christ. Now, if I were to try to complete Metropolitan Anthony's little soundbite there, I never preach orthodoxy, I preach Christ. I just pressed a button. If I were to attempt to complete these thoughts, I imagine he would say that the Christ that he preaches is the one that is taught and sung in the Orthodox Church. And furthermore, He knew the Orthodox Church almost exclusively in its Russian incarnation. But you see how he stood that kind of joke version exactly on its head. Christian first, Orthodox Russian. Or better, for him, Christian was synonymous with Orthodox, because Orthodox isn't a banner, it's not a name, not a symbol. It is, both etymologically and otherwise, Orthodox, with a small o, and that's probably how that prayer meant it. It is the genuine, true teaching and praise of God. And if it isn't that, then we're utterly wasting our time with it. I say all this by way of preamble because, again, the question of identity, who am I, who are we, is at the root of understanding the Orthodox landscape in North America in its ethnic, ecclesiastical, and theological dimensions. Hopefully not in that order, otherwise I'm repeating the joke. Ethnic, ecclesiastical, theological. Beginning with a little bit of a historical overview known to many of you in the audience and repeated by way of summary for others. Orthodoxy has always been lived out in self-governing local churches. These churches developed in the early Christian centuries around the major hubs: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem. This was the original pentarchy, and as the church grew, not only did Rome cease to be numbered among the Orthodox churches, but additionally, local self-governing churches grew in Russia, Georgia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Cyprus, Greece, etc. Each of these became a local, self-governing autocephalous, in other words, church. And as a matter of consequence, each had a de facto ethnic character, something that with the rise of nation states became, if anything, more deeply ingrained. So you always had this historical reality of local incarnations of the church. Immigrants coming to America from their respective native Orthodox countries came to form church communities among their own people here. With some very important exceptions, these communities didn't seek to form a local American Orthodox church, either administratively or as regards identity, but retained the identity and the ecclesiastical governance of the church in their mother country. So this means that instead of having the American Orthodox Church, as you have the Russian Orthodox Church and the Romanian Orthodox Church, you have kind of satellite churches. You have multiple Orthodox jurisdictions in North America. They are administered separately, in most cases as dioceses of their mother churches in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Now, for the Roman Catholics in the audience, imagine if all the Irish Catholics in America were in an Irish archdiocese that looked to Dublin for its primary seat of authority and identity. Same for Roman Catholics of an Italian background. And in each major city, you have one bishop for the Italians, for the Irish, and for all of the different ethnicities. Now, something like that did used to describe in certain parts of North American history the profile of the Catholic Church, and to different degrees you have, Polish Catholic Church, Ukrainian Catholic Church, and you have something a little bit like that. But by and large, the situation has evolved considerably in the past century in Roman Catholicism, to the point where this would sound like it is our reality, but it remains our Orthodox reality here. For the time being, I'm not describing any of the attempted solutions to the Orthodox jurisdictional situation, and I'm leaving out the role and situation of my own church, the Orthodox Church in America. I wanted first to map out the basic situation. And I'd like to fill in the meaning of this phenomenon, first from the theological perspective, then from the sociological and pastoral perspective, and third from the ecclesiastical perspective. And when I say I hope to fill out the meaning, I mean really just to kind of draw a very broad map of the situation along these focuses. And I do not pretend to be comprehensive in any of them. Theologically, this situation brings to mind the fact that there is no church and no theology existing apart from particular places, times, and cultures. God himself and God alone exists outside the universe that he created. But theology, words about God, are always expressed in particular languages at particular times and places. The church and theology are not disembodied things. Jesus Christ himself is an embodied being in history, and his gospel is expressed not only according to Matthew, according to Mark, but according to first century Near Eastern context with its political, religious, and agricultural realities. And all of this shaped the narratives, the parables, the circumstances. Think of even the cross itself. Culturally, that's how it happened, through which the gospel comes to us. The role later on of classical Greek culture on the articulation of theology is enormous. So cultures are vehicles for the conveyance, or the tradition, which is what conveyance is, of the gospel. It's a theological and historical reality. Again, we have this treasure in earthen vessels. And it's possible even to see this in terms of God's providence. Rather than the scandal of particularity, it's possible to argue that God's choice of a particular people, Israel, can be taken further into the idea of the election of Greek culture to give privileged voice to true theology. Father George Florovsky's understanding of Christian Hellenism was rooted precisely in that impulse. But classical Greek culture didn't take immediate ownership of the gospel message, nor did it pass unscathed by the gospel. Greek culture itself was transformed gradually by the gospel. Now, that same logic and these same basic issues, namely the contextual nature of all theology and of all ecclesial reality, same logic comes into play over the progression of time with the evolution of languages, political realities, and with the migration of peoples. The question comes to be, how is theology to be re-embodied into new contexts? How much of the previous context must be carried into the new incarnation? In late antiquity, the Greeks, even as they were adapting Platonic philosophy along the lines of the Christian gospel, had to ask themselves how much of the Semitic character of the gospel had to be carried along, brought in. It's a huge question that was never solved by any formula. Theology has been authoritatively expressed in Greek, in Latin, in Syriac, in Armenian, etc., and later, over many centuries' time, into Slavic and other languages. There's always been the recognition of the need to translate theology, and now the need is to translate it to still other languages, such as English, even as scholars do well to know the original tongues. What of the liturgy? Its content and ethos has been reliably expressed in Greek, Slavic, Arabic languages and musical traditions. Here in America, shouldn't those languages and tonalities be retained in order to transmit the theology and the ethos, at least for some decades? Now it's becoming centuries. Before something can arise organically from the soil that contains reliably that same content and that same ethos, how much is to be retained? For how long? These are the universal missionary questions for Christians. They were certainly faced in the Roman Catholic Church as well, Vatican II being the great watershed moment in that regard. But they challenged the Orthodox Church with its unique immigrant-based jurisdictional landscape here in a particularly acute way. Moving on to sociological and pastoral concerns. All of the immigrant churches have wrestled theologically to some degree or other, mostly on their own, sometimes in counsel with each other, as to how to be Orthodox in North America. But theological concerns were matched and sometimes overtaken by pastoral ones. To what extent is it realistic to foist American Orthodoxy in a new language with new trappings upon recent immigrants whose orthodoxy is somewhat inextricably bound up with the language and trappings of the home country. You and I might see Orthodoxy primarily in terms of liturgical and theological content, and secondarily in terms of the forms that it takes. Some of us may argue this strenuously, but that's not the way it works for most Orthodox Christians in the world. And as we've just noted, it isn't simple, nor is it entirely possible to completely extricate content from form. More thorny and controversial is the factor of ethnic identity. Many of the immigrants' experience of Orthodox Christianity is so bound up with ethnic identity that it becomes first and foremost part of that identity. Orthodoxy becomes a marker and a vehicle of ethnic identity. And to the extent that this is the case for any particular community or person or decision maker, there will be less of a focus on the theological content of the faith, less impetus to establish local North American manifestations of Orthodox Christianity, and likewise less interest in diminishing administrative, spiritual, and hierarchical ties with the motherland. Orthodoxy in these cases becomes a cherished instrument for the preservation of ethnic culture. Not exclusively that, but predominantly that almost, for fear of disappearing into the American cultural melting pot. I don't mean to imply that such people can't be faithful, God-loving, and earnestly praying Christians, but their Christianity is liable either to become subservient to their ethnos, or at least to be blind to the universal character of orthodoxy and to the imperatives of that universality. Immigrants, as we all know, follow any of a range of patterns, from those who seek to retain as much as possible of their ethnic heritage, to the point of living within ethnic ghettos, to those who seek to shed as much of that heritage as possible and become Americanized. The former category are apt to conform to the pattern I've just described, using the church as an ethnic galvanizer. The latter are more apt to shed association with the church altogether, but both of these extremes are acting on the same presumption, namely the church is part and parcel of the motherland and its culture. Rare were the immigrants whose vision and priorities were such that linguistic and ethnic particulars weren't discarded, but were placed at the service of theological and spiritual content. For such visionaries, and you can read about most of them in many of Father Michael Icon's books, for such people, Orthodox Christianity was a holistic way of life that had always transcended boundaries, adapted to new localities, and in time came to be expressed in new local self-governing churches. Along those lines, these immigrants sought to plant orthodoxy within America, and in different ways in Western Europe. America is what concerns us today. But they sought to plant orthodoxy within America in a way that would be poised to grow more and more organically local, and as a direct result of this, more and more administratively unified, and finally, autocephalous. My sense is that this vision, which flourished in the mid to late 20th century, has been waning ever since the 1980s. But I'll come back to that at the close of my essay. Having discussed briefly the theological and then the pastoral issues, I'd like to come to the ecclesiastical issues. Ecclesiastical is the banner under which I'd like to talk about the issue of primacy. Primacy might just as well have been treated under theological issues, in that we trace both conciliarity and primacy, authority from within and authority from above, to our doctrine of the Holy Trinity itself. And the fact is, all Orthodox Christians properly believe in the need for primacy in the ministry of the church at every level: parochial, diocesan, local church, and among all the local churches. Our theology and our canons have it so. But the question in our own day becomes not theological, not ecclesiological, but ecclesiastical. by which I mean, somewhat cynically, that primacy today has largely to do with how the churches sort out their pecking order, with only varying degrees of concern for Orthodox unity and integrity. Now, primacy obviously is a major factor, especially in the past few years, of the Orthodox-Catholic dialogue. But its implications there go beyond what you might think. Of course, there's the vital discussion on the nature of the primacy of the Pope of Rome. But apart from that, the Orthodox-Catholic bilateral dialogue has also brought to light long-standing intra-Orthodox divergences of outlook on primacy. These divergences, and I'll shortly get to their relevance for the North American scene, but these divergences have to do with two interrelated questions. The main question being, what is the nature of the primacy of the Patriarch of Constantinople? He is first among equals. He has had the title Ecumenical Patriarch since the 6th century, and 100 years prior to that, the 28th canon of the Council of Chalcedon gave jurisdiction to Constantinople over the barbarian lands. Yet these canonical decisions are understood in widely different ways. No one denies the reality of primacy among the churches and the unique primatial role of the Patriarch of Constantinople. Yet history has seen different modes of the exercise of this primacy, from maximal to minimal. The second question likewise has to do with the nature of Constantinopolitan primacy, and it concerns how one identifies canonical orthodoxy. The view expressed by Constantinople recently at the Orthodox Catholic dialogues is that the Orthodox Church consists in those churches in communion with Constantinople, thus following the Roman Catholic model of communion with Rome as that which constitutes being Roman Catholic. The Russian Orthodox Church, among others, at the same dialogue, contested that the Orthodox Church has always consisted in churches in communion not just with Constantinople, but with each other. But there's a divergence here. Why is this relevant then to the scope of my presentation here? Because divergent understandings of the role of Constantinople have had important implications for the Orthodox landscape in America. For one, the disputes since 1970 over the canonical status of my own church, the Orthodox Church in America, have everything to do with different conceptions of the role of the primatial see of Constantinople in granting autocephaly. Second, territorial disputes in Estonia, the Ukraine, for example, have resulted in temporary severances of communion. Where are these felt most sharply? Not in Russia or in Greece, where Orthodoxy is effectively monoethnic. These breaks in communion are felt here in the West, where churches exist side by side with each other, and despite all odds are working towards a common life together and are thrust out of communion with each other. The old African saying is, when two elephants fight, what really gets hurt is the grass. That's us. Add to this that whatever substantive or symbolic actions and structures have been set up to the effect of pan-Orthodox cooperation and common life here in America have been hobbled perennially by disputes about primacy, pecking order. SCOBA, the Standing Conference of Orthodox Bishops in America, which existed from 1960 until 2010, as well as pan-Orthodox missionary and charitable initiatives, have all had to grapple constantly with questions of pecking order. To what extent did all these bodies need to be headed ex officio by Constantinople through its Greek archdiocese? What would be the role of the OCA, that thorn in the Constantinopolitan concept of church order? The new coordinating body, the Assembly of Canonical Bishops of North and Central America, has been inaugurated through a global pan-Orthodox process. On the one hand, the founding documents of the Assembly of Bishops enshrines the headship and auspices of the Patriarch of Constantinople. On the other hand, significantly, The membership of the assemblies, and thus the Orthodox identity of the member churches, according to the charter, is determined not by their communion with Constantinople, but by their communion with each other. Conclusion. Where is the assembly of bishops taking us? How will it affect the life of Orthodox Christians in the parishes? Are we headed with the assembly towards some kind of pan-Orthodox unity? In one sense, it's too early to judge. The assembly has met a couple of times. It has established committees that will do the bulk of the coordinating work. Given the rarity of plenary meetings, given their short duration, and the countless hours spent in social protocol rather than actual action, committees are the only hope for any movement. But the key question is, what is motivating the work of the committees and the assembly? Is there any momentum left for an American Orthodoxy? Is that what people, bishops, priests, us, really want? What do they want? What do we want? It seems to me that calls for Orthodox unity have lessened of late. The centrifugal pull of jurisdictions is outweighing the centripetal force of integration. The assets of the status quo outweigh the liabilities of change. What are these perceived assets of the status quo? For one, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the state of parallel jurisdictions has been the status quo for so long that it barely feels broken anymore. And this is a tragedy. On the one hand, the Episcopal assemblies have been founded with the explicit goal of the ancient norm of one bishop, one city. But I don't think people believe this anymore. They don't see the situation as seriously broken. After all, we're all in communion, right? And that for most people is enough. One of my professors used to say that the sole reason that the anomaly of Orthodoxy in America and the jurisdictions is even tolerable is that everybody says that it's an anomaly, that it's wrong, that it's broken, that it's provisional. Now, what happens when people stop saying that? Right? Another perceived asset of the status quo is the security that it provides. My Russian or my Greek or Syrian or Romanian liturgy, hierarchy, structure is time-tested over centuries. There's no need to form a new pioneer cowboy orthodoxy in America. The risk is too great. Furthermore, new immigrants continue to come, and don't they need the familiarity of the linguistic and structural trappings of the Church of the Mother Country? The mother churches, for their part, in many cases see their American dioceses as important to their own existence, not to mention their financial solvency. Some have called for their immigrant communities in America to be sure to attend only their own ethnic churches. They are deeply invested in the status quo and have zero interest in a local autocephalous American Orthodox Church. The canonical ideal of an administratively unified, self-governing local American church is simply not enough of a pull to outweigh the comforts of the status quo. They're not enough to compensate for the enormous efforts that would be required to genuinely unite. Calls to unity still form part of many pan-Orthodox Vespers sermons, but they're no longer heartfelt. The thousands of converts to Orthodoxy who play an enormous role in the landscape, but whom I haven't even mentioned here, have striven to keep alive a vision of a unified Orthodoxy in America. Yet they have not presented a unified vision for what it would look like. In many respects, a healthy Orthodox spiritual life, growth in theological knowledge, and recently a proliferating monastic life have been continuing to grow and flourish, but these all flourish within the churches apart from each other. With very little sense of mutual accountability and mutual need. When there are pan-Orthodox initiatives, conferences, gatherings, study groups, people meet and work, they perhaps gain a very great deal and do a great service, and then they return to their respective ethnic churches. I regret ending on a pessimistic note. It's frankly very uncharacteristic of me to do so. I'm aware that it's possible to see this situation in more hopeful and favorable ways. Others, even among you in the audience whom I know, would probably paint a bleaker picture than I have. And my hope is that other talks and discussions here can fill in the enormous gaps in the picture that I've begun to paint here, and also to constructively continue to identify ways to continue to work for a healthy, God-pleasing Orthodoxy in North America. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Dr. Boutegna for kicking us off. Why don't we take a 5-minute stretch break, and then we'll reconvene in 5 minutes for our first session.
My name is Barbara Rico, and I'm an interim director of Catholic Studies here at LMU. And we have a very exciting panel today. I'd like first to introduce our first speaker. Radu Gordianu is an Orthodox priest who teaches at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. He is president of the Orthodox Theological Society in America and the director of Duquesne's annual Holy Spirit Lecture. His research focuses on ecumenical ecclesiologies, the relationship between the Trinity and the Church, local and universal, clergy and laity, especially in the context of the dialogue between Orthodox and Catholic traditions, and he has recently published an important monograph on this subject. He has also published on the theology of creation, ecological issues, iconography, Trinitarian theology, and spirituality. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gordianu, who will be speaking on primacy, nationality, and the quest for Orthodox Catholic unity.
The theological issues that create tensions within Orthodoxy are oftentimes identical with those that divide the Orthodox and Catholic churches. One such issue, if not the most significant matter separating Orthodox and Catholics, is that of primacy. The same is a contentious problem within Orthodoxy, where there are several levels of primacy or primacies in plural. In this paper, I would like to outline several levels of authority within the Orthodox churches in the US, the problems and opportunities that these primacies offer, and then analyze their significance for the Orthodox Catholic dialogue on primacy. As we shall see shortly, national identity is quite significant to our discussion. I will start with a question that derives directly from the theme of our seminar. Is Orthodoxy united into one local church in America? Speaking of pan-Orthodoxy in the title implies that there are several flavors of Orthodoxy, but it does not necessarily say that there is no unity among them. As a matter of fact, at the basic, though very real level, I suggest that Orthodoxy is one. The diverse national churches in America are united through their teaching, Episcopal communion, and Eucharist. Without diminishing the importance of this statement, however, one also has to affirm the differences that exist between the various jurisdictions in these regards. That is probably why the title also says that we are moving towards a local church, suggesting that we are not there yet. So let me first speak a little bit about unity in faith. The ecumenical Grundaxiom that unity in teaching does not mean uniformity holds true for Orthodoxy in the US as well. There is a significant degree of diversity from the way that different national churches celebrate the liturgy, to the calendar that they use, various practices concerning divorce, election of bishops, or means to receive converts into Orthodoxy, to mention just a few. Despite their practical and theological differences, all national Orthodox churches have maintained unity in faith and dogma. This unity is enriched by the diversity that exists at the level of theological opinions or theologumena, as the Spirit has been manifested differently in various contexts. In our move towards a local church, we can only rejoice in the variety of traditions that we bring from all parts of the world. One thing that we need to address, however, is the need to include in our family the Oriental Orthodox churches, or pre-Chalcedonian or non-Chalcedonian churches. It seems that when we're talking about a local Orthodoxy in the United States, many times we forget this very important family. Our dialogue started on an informal basis in 1964, but since 1985 it has continued in various ways, including at the level of joint theological commissions, and even before that, under the World Council of Churches, there have been significant dialogues. The Commission's most important statements in 1989 in Chambézy in 1990 show that despite centuries of alienation and terminological confusion, our two churches share the same Orthodox faith. Consequently, at the practical level, and sometimes with the blessings of individual bishops, maybe I shouldn't have said that in public, but it does happen, members of our churches share in the Eucharist. If that is the case, an American Orthodoxy must include these traditions, since we share the same faith. Both internationally and locally, we need to solve other issues, such as overlapping jurisdictions. But it is important to keep in mind which families we want to unite, so that we do not miss on their gifts. Our unity will be enriched by the diverse gifts that various traditions bring as they grow together in Christ under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. So let me say a few words about Episcopal communion. As I have alluded about, unity in teaching does not necessarily result in Episcopal communion. If somehow understandable in the case of Eastern and Oriental churches, given our 16 centuries of separation, we actually killed each other all these centuries, so I'm calling it centuries of separation. Anything less than full Episcopal communion among other Orthodox churches is simply scandalous. A discussion of Episcopal primacies is absolutely necessary within Orthodoxy, and I will attempt to simply outline some directions here. Episcopal communion represents an essential aspect of unity, since the bishop is the center of the local Eucharistic assembly. St. Ignatius of Antioch stressed that the bishop is an image of Christ at the Last Supper, while Tertullian added that the bishop is in the church and the church is in the bishop. As the visible image of Christ in the liturgy, the bishop becomes both a visible sign and an instrument of unity, since the same Eucharist is celebrated in all churches, and the same una sancta, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, is manifested locally in the Eucharistic assembly. Nicholas Afanasiev had a significant contribution in this regard. Another important Orthodox dimension of Episcopal communion is its emphasis on common decision-making based on the system of synodality. At the synods of the early church, the bishop represented the faith of his community, then took the decisions of the council back to his faithful and submitted them to his diocese for reception. Unity was achieved by consensus not only among participant bishops, but throughout the entire church and in the mind of Christ. Thus, Orthodox unity in America does not regard exclusively the bishops, but the faithful in each diocese as well. If Orthodox historians tend to idealize the system of synodality, American theologians have no excuse to do so. Here is a brief description of our situation with its advantages and challenges. Presently, Orthodox churches in America have Eucharistic communion, even though they are separated by ethnicity, for example, Greek, Romanian, Serbian. Or sometimes they're separated by canonical affiliation. There is a Romanian Orthodox church here in the United States under the Patriarchate in Romania, and another Romanian diocese under the Orthodox Church in America, under the OCA. So it's not enough that we were divided by ethnicity. political and geographical differences also determined us to have separate dioceses. These Orthodox churches have the same geographical territory, so their jurisdictions overlap. Some of them have their own synod that decides on administrative issues pertaining to internal matters. In other cases, the hierarchs of American territories participate in the synod of their mother churches as representatives, and I don't know how this sounds to you, just try to have the map in your mind. The United States and Romania. And we have the American diocese in the Romanian Orthodox Synod. All the hierarchs, however, gather periodically in what used to be the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in the Americas, SCOBA. But Orthodox churches in America are in a period of transition now towards the Episcopal Assembly of the Canonical Orthodox hierarchs in North and Central America. This Episcopal Assembly does not have any compulsory administrative authority over its members. In this regard, it is similar to USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, whose decisions are authoritative to the extent to which individual bishops, as heads of their dioceses, support them. The similarity ends when considering that these decisions could also become authoritative if the Pope mandated them, but Orthodoxy does not have a Pope to impose a decision over the autocephalous churches. Besides individual synods and the Episcopal Assembly, there is a third model of church structure, namely the Orthodox Church in America, OCA. It is comprised of several ethnic churches with overlapping jurisdictions, yet the synod and other structures of the OCA have authority over its members. I fully agree with John Zizoulas when he deplores the existence of overlapping jurisdictions within Orthodoxy, distinct from each other based on their ethnic or political character. He writes in a very categorical, though justified tone. The present-day situation of the Orthodox diaspora is such an unfortunate, dangerous, and totally unacceptable phenomenon. It allows ethnic and cultural differences to become grounds of ecclesiastical communion centered on different bishops. A bishop who does not in himself transcend ethnic and cultural differences becomes a minister of division, not of unity. This is something that the Orthodox should consider very seriously if indeed, listen to Zizoulas' words, distortion of the very nature of the church is to be avoided, end quote. And yet, despite many imperfections of Orthodoxy in America, the separation here is only relative because the bishops do come together in the Episcopal Assembly, and the OCA is one synod with administrative authority, even though it is comprised of overlapping jurisdictions. Most importantly, the churches share one common tradition, capital T, while maintaining a certain diversity that pertains to traditions, small t, and of course, they share in the Eucharist. Sometimes this latter point needs to be qualified. I'll give you some examples. If ROCOR churches are allowed to receive communion in most Orthodox churches, up until recently, they did not share the Eucharist with OCA. And a Greek friend of mine was telling me how in his city, during Lent, they had pre-sanctified liturgies by rotation in various parishes. So the ROCOR priest came to his Greek parish and received communion, but they didn't go to the OCA parish, even though everybody else went to the OCA parish and received communion. So the Greek priest just didn't know what to say, where to receive communion, what to do. He just received it everywhere, of course. After the dialogue between the Russian Patriarchate and ROCOR, the situation has changed, but is still complex, and is not the place to insist on this subject here. The Orthodox picture in America is further complicated by the so-called all-calendarist churches. The calendar is another issue that urgently needs a solution both here and internationally. For example, Greece and Romania have adopted the new calendar, while Russia and Serbia are still on the old calendar. There is Eucharistic communion among these churches, and for them the calendar is not a church-dividing issue. But within Greece and within Romania, just to give some examples, there are groups that refuse to adopt the new calendar. They have established new synods, and this break in Episcopal communion has resulted in the break of Eucharistic communion both within their specific national churches and here in the United States sometimes. Having acknowledged these exceptions, I hope you'll allow me to continue with the presumption that, in general, Orthodox churches in the US share in the Eucharist. So let me speak a little bit with this presumption on the relevance for the Orthodox Catholic dialogue. Of course, ideally, we should have only one American synod without overlapping jurisdictions, fully local church. This is exactly the purpose of the Episcopal Assembly, but in the meantime, we consider ourselves united and we generally receive communion together, right? Even though we do not have a unified synod and we have overlapping jurisdictions. I believe that this situation is very significant for the degree of episcopal unity that we see between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, and I should add, official relations with the Orthodox Oriental churches. The situation of American Orthodoxy shows that along the path toward full unity with the Roman Catholic Church, Eucharistic communion is possible even before solving all the jurisdictional issues. By regarding the Orthodox and Catholic churches as two local churches of the same universal church, albeit with overlapping jurisdictions. Thus, a united church might have overlapping jurisdictions as long as these member churches get together in an institution after the model of the Episcopal Assembly first, which has no administrative authority, then after the model of OCA, which has authority, and then one synod without overlapping jurisdiction, a situation that neither the Orthodox nor the Catholic families have yet accomplished. This is very important to state, because many times we get together in dialogues and we're really looking way far there. One synod, no overlapping jurisdictions, but neither the Orthodox nor the Catholics have that at the present time. Such a temporary situation should be acceptable to all Orthodox churches in the world, which now tacitly but actively support the situation in the United States, as we have heard in the previous paper. And to the Catholic Church, it should be acceptable, since Roman Catholic dioceses overlap with Byzantine Catholic dioceses, not to mention the multitude of ethnic dioceses overlapping within the Byzantine Catholic family. Of course, there are many issues separating Orthodox and Catholicism, but we should not allow canonical differences to stand in the way of our union, just as they do not impede various national Orthodox churches to share in the Eucharist. In the early church, canonical disputes existed abundantly, but they were not reasons for separation. It is important to discern what elements need to be discussed before achieving Eucharistic communion and what can be postponed. Presently, it appears that the only church-dividing issues between Orthodoxy and Catholicism are papal primacy and papal infallibility, and Eucharistic sharing is impossible before solving or at least significantly advancing these issues. Nicholas Afanasieff, an Orthodox theologian, proposed that actually we should have Eucharistic communion before we solve this issue, but his suggestion seems to be unacceptable today, officially speaking, to neither Orthodox nor Catholics. He also proposed, Afanasieff, that doctrinal unity should be accomplished in the future if the Catholic Church changes its understanding of primacy to refer only to the West. He wrote before the Pope renounced his title of Patriarch of the West. Many Orthodox have regarded that renunciation as a move in the wrong direction. And his view of infallibility to be in harmony with the concepts of conciliarity and reception and doctrine. And that's where Afanasieff stops. Do you notice Orthodox theologians most of the times have suggestions what Catholics are supposed to do? I am an Orthodox theologian, but let me also suggest that we Orthodox, on our part, would have to reanalyze our understanding of the Bishop of Rome as primus inter pares, first among equals. We already believe that, by the way. If in the past the emphasis fell on inter pares, among equals, now Orthodoxy might state positively what primus means. What kind of primacy are we willing to give to the Bishop of Rome? Most Orthodox theology has concentrated exclusively on refuting the Catholic position, but now needs to propose concrete ways in which the papacy should be exercised in a united Christendom, including within Orthodoxy. After having presented the situation with the overlapping jurisdictions, don't you think we need a pope to come and solve it? Because we've been trying it, it didn't work. But what kind of pope? What kind of pope do we need, okay? So, we don't really know. But let me give it a try anyway. Ideally, from an Orthodox perspective, in a united church, the pope would be first among equals, primum inter pares, within a united synod of bishops without overlapping jurisdictions. That's the purpose. That's what we're looking for. Bilateral, international, and national dialogues are currently attempting to outline the concrete details of these proposals. However, what matters most at the concrete level, Eucharistic communion, does not have to be postponed until this time of perfect union. The Orthodox and Catholic churches could have Eucharistic communion when their bishops would be gathered in a common synod, even though temporarily maintaining their separate structures, according to the model of the Orthodox churches in America. In line with Eucharistic ecclesiology, this synod would respect the fullness of its local churches, the dioceses comprising it. At the same time, dioceses would not be isolated from each other, but would be united in the same Christ as fully manifested in their Eucharistic assemblies. They would enjoy a unity by mutual identity in Christ, so they would gather together in an American church. I'm using here local church to refer to the diocese, even though in the title of our symposium, local church seems to mean American church, but both senses are widely spread within Orthodox parlance, so I'm just clarifying. The American church would be in communion with all other churches in the world, and here is where a ministry of universal unity becomes absolutely necessary. Neither the American nor the universal authorities would stand above the diocese in the sense of worldly power. However, as Staniloae and Zizoulas, two Orthodox theologians, have rightly observed, the ministry of the bishop is not simply local, but his authority extends outside of his diocese when exercised in a synod, where I would add when a universal ministry is being exercised. I have slowly introduced various levels of primacy, wherein the plural primacies. At the local Eucharistic level, there is the primacy of the bishop. Regionally, in metropolitan systems, nationally, in autocephalous churches and Catholic national episcopal conferences, and universally, in ecumenical councils and the papacy. Zizoulas contends that the Orthodox and Catholic churches have different models of authority that reflect a fundamental ecclesiological difference between them. Catholicism has three levels of authority: local, regional, or episcopal conferences, and universal, the papacy. In my opinion, Catholic theology needs to explain the role of the Roman Curia in a way that does not introduce a fourth level of authority. Practically speaking, theoretically, of course, it works, but practically. And then, it should also talk about the Synod of Bishops that represent the entire Catholic world when they meet regularly in Rome for the Synod of Bishops. They should have universal authority, in my opinion. Instead, they only have an advisory role to the papacy. Moreover, national conferences of Catholic bishops do not have authority except by virtue of the authority of each participant bishop in his local church, or if the Pope ratifies their decisions. So I'm less optimistic than Zizoulas in regard to regional primacies in the Catholic Church. However, I agree with him that in present-day Orthodoxy there are only two levels of conciliarity, local and regional. Given the Orthodox system of autocephaly, regional synods are headed by the primates of those respective churches. Even when the primates gather for pan-Orthodox conferences, they remain independent, so their gathering does not fall under a universal umbrella, but has a regional type of authority. This is also the case of the ecumenical councils, since they are not permanent institutions, and I would add some councils, such as the second, has been convened as a regional council. The present state of the ecumenical dialogue, as well as the dire need of higher authority to solve the issues of the overlapping jurisdiction, point to the need for a universal authority. Returning to Zizoulas, he expects that the Pope will act communally together with the other bishops, respecting the fullness of the local church. At the same time, the Pope would have a moral and canonical authority that would enable him to convene councils and to express the common voice of the church as the mouthpiece of the entire church and of the consensus of the bishop with whom he is sacramentally equal. And yet, it is important to remember that authority does not reside in his person as an individual, but as a representative of his local church that has primacy among other churches. In other words, the Church of Rome would have primacy over the church in America, will have canonical authority, and will represent the mouthpiece of the universal church. In practice, sadly, we are not prepared to tackle these questions. On the Orthodox side, I perceive a strong anti-Catholic feeling and ultra-sensitivity to any papal acts, let alone teachings, that allude to any leadership role that he might have. we are already ultra-sensitive to anything that the ecumenical patriarch does. It's even worse when it comes to the Orthodox Catholic dialogue. Practically, many Orthodox are not ascribing the Pope the honor that they give to the primates of their autocephalous churches. The Patriarch of Serbia has much more authority among his bishops than are willing to ascribe authority to the Bishop of Rome. For example, the primate of the national church has a real authority over the bishops in his territory, convenes synods, sets their agenda, and speaks for that national church. Are the Orthodox willing to extend the same honor to the Bishop of Rome, knowing that there would be more unity within Orthodoxy, especially in America, where we need to stop having overlapping jurisdictions and parallel synods? Concerning the Catholic side, Zizoulas was saddened that at the current moment the Church of Rome is taking no account of the Ratzinger formula. In Graz in 1976, Ratzinger, then Cardinal, he affirmed that as to the doctrine of papacy, Catholics should not ask the Orthodox to agree on everything beyond the first millennium. The question is, how was the papacy exercised in the first millennium? And the international dialogue seems to be stuck on this issue right now. Moreover, forgive me, the model didn't work. We split. So we should listen to the Holy Spirit where the Spirit wants to lead us. At the same time, though, futures have their roots in the past. So we need to listen to past stories of how the papacy was exercised throughout history. The Orthodox should be listened to a very successful story, and that is the move from the Catholic Church in the United States with overlapping jurisdictions to a rather unified diocese today. Are we willing to listen to that? Are Catholics willing to listen to successful Orthodox stories of synodality in national churches? Here in America, we might have a chance to find the answer to these questions. In closing, just one paragraph. How would the local American Orthodox Church look like in an ideal world? It would have doctrinal unity, but not uniformity, since it would include various traditions imported from all over the world, which is quite characteristic of American society in this regard. Ideally, there would be only one synod without overlapping jurisdictions, but we should be ready to call it a local American church even earlier, while still having overlapping jurisdictions if it follows the model of the OCA and incorporates all the Orthodox. We'd be talking about an American Orthodoxy, but we would not mean it in an isolationist way, since our national church would be in communion with other national churches, and, forgive me, now I'm really pushing it, somebody from outside the United States might have a real ministry of primacy, a ministry of unity for all Christians around the world. I'm dreaming big, but I also hope that I have outlined some small steps that can take us in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting first presentation. It's now my pleasure to introduce Susan K. Wood, a Sister of Charity of Leavenworth, Kansas, professor and chair of the Department of Theology of Marquette University. She received her doctorate in systematic theology from Marquette University, and she's been very active in ecumenical work. Indeed, she serves on a number of very important boards: the U.S. Lutheran Roman Catholic Dialogue, the U.S. Roman Catholic Orthodox Theological Consultation, the Conversation Between the Roman Catholic Church and the Baptist World Alliance, and the International Lutheran Catholic Dialogue. She has also participated in consultations on baptism, theological anthropology, and the nature and purpose of ecumenical dialogue sponsored by Faith and the Order of the World Council of Churches and the Joint Working Group. She's associate editor of Pro Ecclesia and serves on the editorial advisory board of the journal Ecclesiology. In addition to numerous articles, she has published Spiritual Exegesis, Sacramental Orders, which was also translated into Spanish, and One Baptism, Ecumenical Dimensions of the Doctrine of Baptism. Her present work is a study of the relationship between the permanent deaconate and lay ecclesial ministry, Her paper is entitled North American Orthodox Catholic Dialogue, A Vision of the Possible. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wood.
It's an honor to be here, so thank you for the invitation. And I can't wait for a response to get to respond to it usually. In October of 2010, the North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation issued a statement, Steps Toward a Reunited Church, a sketch of an Orthodox Catholic vision for the future. This document has been translated into at least 2 languages, Italian and German. Italian is important because it means that the folks in Rome are going to read it. And so it's receiving international attention. The genesis, as well as the content of this document, says much about the possibilities for Orthodox Catholic unity, I think. And a new structure, I would hope, for Orthodoxy in the United States might offer an opportunity to review what the North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation envisions as a way forward to achieving full visible unity. Now, typically, dialogue meetings with the participation of professional theologians involve academic research on disputed issues and the presentation of rather lengthy and dense academic papers. This scholarship is essential background for the statements issued by the dialogue. But it should be of no surprise to any of you that since for a long time the topic of that group has been primacy, that little progress is being made. In fact, I was here at Loyola Marymount when the dialogue met, and Metropolitan Maximus said to me, you know we're not going to budge on this. Because this is the most obstinate impasse to unity of our 2 communions. When it seemed like there was no progress to be made, the consultation changed its method of operation. Rather than the long academic paper, each member of the consultation was asked to write a 5-page paper without footnotes, envisioning what unity between Orthodox and Catholics could look like. A subcommittee then collated the results and drafted the vision for the future document. The result was a pragmatic statement consisting in needed actions and principles. And I think it cut to the chase, and this is why it's receiving attention today. Surely there is theological work behind these actions and principles, but the advantage of the process is that it identified the elements needed for full communion, and I think suggests a way forward. When we envision full communion, most of us probably envision it as a top-down endeavor. Catholics think that first the Orthodox need to acknowledge the primacy of the Pope, and then everything else gets worked out from there. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think a reason why it's not going to happen is that there is no Orthodox Pope that's parallel to the Roman Catholic Pope. Therefore, anything short of a great holy council or synod or whatever you call it doesn't have the authority to enter into that kind of full communion. And I think if we just take a good look at that, that means that the answer is going to have to come from the bottom up, not the top down. And that's going to be probably the thesis of what I'm going to say today. And so then we have to look at what can regional structures accomplish since we don't have the structures in place for the other direction. And I don't think we've ever looked at this. And I didn't even have this thought until I sat down to write this paper. because, you know, it's not only that the Orthodox don't have a body short of this great holy council to issue that kind of a statement. The principle of synodality among the Orthodox would require that this be an action undertaken through a synod in which all the concerned parties participated. So I think this would, you know, that would be needed to respect, you know, the Orthodox genius, if you will, you know, of what drives their polity. This leads me to suggest that the road to unity at the present time may best be through subsidiary structures in the two churches. This cannot result in full communion at a subsidiary level, but many actions can occur there that would prepare the way for eventual communion through perhaps a great holy synod and papal action. Now, I think an autocephalous church in the United States would assist this project, but they told me last night at dinner this wasn't going to happen. But I'll let you all work that out. But I think what is needed, and where the conference title helps us, is that if there is a way for the Orthodox in the United States to come to pan-Orthodox unity and to have a structure that can actually act and make decisions at the local level, this would be needed. If this cannot happen through the Episcopal Assembly, and I'm sorry that I knocked off the thing that keeps me from doing that to the microphone. But if short of that, I think there's less hope, you know, if there isn't a structure through which the Orthodox can act. I think what is required of both communions is the will to act as far as each is able to be in communion with each other until final full communion is established. And I don't think we've actually tested that will to the full extent that we should. This is a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach to communion. It differs from what has been called grassroots ecumenism, insofar as it involves not just the laity being engaged in common ventures, but personal communion among hierarchs and through existing church structures. So this is not something more than informal ecumenism. This would be an exercise of one of the principles identified by the North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation, the principle of subsidiarity. Again, what is required is the will for full communion. So I will review the main features of the structure of worldwide ecclesial communion identified in that document, indicating what may be possible and asking some questions. The first item in that document was mutual recognition. The larger units of Orthodox and Catholic Christianity, including patriarchates and other autocephalous churches, would explicitly recognize each other as authentic embodiments of the one Church of Christ founded on the apostles. This would include the recognition of our fundamental agreement on central Christian dogma as revealed in Scripture and articulated in the ecumenical councils, despite variances in our theological and liturgical traditions. Okay, my comment. The Catholic Church already recognizes Orthodox churches as churches. I'm not sure whether all Orthodox churches have done the same for the Catholics. Can an autocephalous Orthodox church in America, can the Episcopal Assembly, can whatever the structure is, do the same from its own perspective? Because again, if you ask the question, what body in Orthodoxy has the authority to recognize the ecclesiality of another body is the question. Now this would entail recognizing, what would follow from this? What would follow is recognizing the baptisms within the Catholic Church to be valid as actions of a true church and not just valid by way of the economy. which is the action of some Orthodox groups, not all. In terms of agreements on central Christian dogma, I would hope that there would be some recognition on the Catholic side of the statement on the filioque that this group came out with. Certainly, it is not a requirement in Catholicism that the filioque always be used. The Pope has engaged in liturgies with the Patriarch Bartholomew the First, for one, at a liturgy in which both shared in the homily, both recited the creed together without the filioque, and both gave a blessing at the end of that liturgy. So this was a certain sharing in liturgical action, and the Pope, the highest level, has participated in Eucharistic prayer service, liturgies and other prayer services where the creed was recited without the filioque. So there is flexibility in this on the Catholic side. The recommendation of the dialogue was that we drop that from liturgical usage. But the question behind all this is, given that agreement, even if Catholics don't, I will say that the USCCB cannot unilaterally just drop it from the liturgy. It doesn't have the authority to do that. But given the movement that has happened on that topic, can Catholics celebrate liturgies with Orthodox, dropping it out of sensibility to Orthodox? And can Orthodox realize that the filioque went in the first place to protect a Christological dogma against Arianism? So it was not added against the Orthodox. It was against a certain Christological heresy when Charlemagne put it in, made it more universally used. So can that be a difference in our communions that then is not church dividing, given that progress? The second principle is accepted diversity. Different parts of the single body of Christ, drawing on these different histories and different cultural and spiritual traditions, would live in full ecclesial communion with each other without requiring any of the parts to forgo its own traditions and practices. My comment is, this principle essentially affirms that nothing needs to change in our traditions and practices. Can we affirm that? This isn't absorption of all groups into Catholicism as a cultural tradition, but it would respect that diversity. The third principle is liturgical sharing. Members of all the churches in communion would be able to receive the sacraments in the other churches. Priests and bishops would express their unity in concelebrations, and the heads of the other churches would be commemorated liturgically in the diptychs. In addition, other forms of common liturgical prayer would be encouraged as a regular practice involving both our churches. My comment: short of full communion, regular sacramental sharing is not possible. Full concelebration is not possible. However, there are possibilities short of that. On June 24th, 2004, as I mentioned before, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I participated in a limited way in the Papal Pauline Mass celebrated by Benedict XVI. Both delivered the homily, they recited the creed together, and both gave a blessing. Could this be a model for limited liturgical sharing in other venues? If the Pope can do it, maybe other folks can too. The Catholic Church does permit limited sacramental sharing of Orthodox. The 1993 Ecumenical Directory gives a number of norms for sacramental sharing. Because there is very close communion in matters of faith, and because through the celebration of the Eucharist of the Lord in each of these churches, the Church of God is built up and grows in stature, and although separated from us, these churches still possess true sacraments, above all by apostolic succession, the priesthood, and the Eucharist. And this is the grounds for these are the ecclesiological and sacramental grounds, according to the understanding of the Catholic Church, for allowing and even encouraging some sharing in liturgical worship even in the Eucharist with these churches. Now, it's recognized, however, that Eastern churches, on the basis of their own ecclesiological understanding, have more restrictive disciplines in this matter, which we are asked to respect. Pastors should carefully instruct the faithful so that they may be clearly aware of the proper reasons for this kind of sharing in liturgical worship. So there is sharing, especially when Orthodox do not have access to their own ministers. They can receive the sacrament of penance, Eucharist, and anointing of the sick. Catholics can do the same if they're permitted by the Orthodox, but my understanding is that they're not permitted at the present time. And that there are different disciplines in terms of fasting, confession before communion, and frequency of communion and all that. So there should be care to avoid scandal. There should be a care to avoid proselytism. And we are asked to observe the discipline and the rules of Orthodoxy. The question is, this has never been reciprocal to Catholics. And my question to the Orthodox is, what would be necessary to make it reciprocal? And I wonder if that goes back to that first principle of the lack of full recognition of the ecclesiality of Catholicism by Orthodox. In other words, do Orthodox recognize Catholic ministers? Do they recognize the validity of sacraments as needed to emanate from a true church? And so what needs to be fixed to make that more reciprocal? The next principle is synodality. That the bishops of the United Churches would meet regularly in regional synods, which would regulate the common life and relationship of the churches in any particular reason. Now, national synods in U.S. Catholic history are rare. There were 3 plenary councils of Baltimore in 1852, 1866, and 1884. Most Catholic synods are now diocesan, and the question is, can more local and regional synods include participation of our ecumenical partners? I'll leave that for discussion later. The next principle was mission, that all churches would share a common concern for what directly affects their unity, as well as for the mission of churches to non-Christians. Certainly, we should be able to cooperate with each other in missionary activity. I think this will be essential. I would just point out that as the world around us becomes more post-Christian, it's a shame if we're all involved in, the minutiae of our own disagreements and to the extent that we cannot work together to the wider culture. The next principle is subsidiarity, following the ancient principle recognized as normative for well-organized human structures. Higher instances of episcopal authority would only be expected to act when lower instances are unable to make and implement the decisions necessary for continuing the faith. I think that's the principle that should drive efforts towards some of this sharing that we're working at. I'm not in no way advocating that we either communion violate its own polity, but I just don't think we've explored what is possible to the full extent. I'm running out of time here. There are more things in a subsidiarity, like election of bishops, and then bishops presenting themselves to other churches as leaders of their own level, to their own patriarch, and to the Bishop of Rome as first among patriarchs. The exchange and reception of letters of communion. But I think even short of that universal level, when bishops are created, I think there should be some acknowledgement from different communions. For example, from the decree on ecumenism, Catholics say that our churches are in imperfect communion. If our churches are in imperfect communion, so are our bishops are in imperfect communion. So in what way do we acknowledge that communion that they do share with each other? That in some sense they are brother bishops. Okay, conclusion. At least to some extent, these first principles, and I didn't talk about primacy because that's at the universal level, and I'm talking at a more subsidiary level. At least to some extent, these first principles, mutual recognition of each other as churches, accepted diversity, synodality, mission, and subsidiarity, are principles that can be enacted short of full visible communion. They are also principles that a new Orthodox structure in the United States should at least partially implement in concert with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The Catholic Church already acknowledges the identity of the Orthodox Church as church. It is possible for each of us to acknowledge and celebrate the diversity of the other. It is possible for us to work together for the mission of the churches to non-Christians. And finally, it is possible for bishops to formally acknowledge the impartial communion they share with each other. What remains out of reach at the local level is complete Eucharistic liturgical sharing, although other forms of liturgical prayer other than the Eucharist reading is possible. A new Orthodox structure in the United States may offer an opportunity for an ecumenism from below, rather than wait for a great holy synod or council. The only body probably capable of establishing full communion with the Catholic Church. If the churches in this century could implement the principles of the vision statement as fully as possible at a subsidiary level, that would prepare the way procedurally, and more importantly, prepare our hearts for eventual full communion.
Thank you, Professor Wood. We've had two splendid papers, and one of the things over the years that I've really enjoy about the Huffington Conference is the opportunity that it offers for the two participants to respond to one another's work. And so without further ado, I'd like to ask each of the participants perhaps to start with the point of intersection and maybe to highlight one point that you would like further clarification about.
Okay. How serious is overlapping jurisdiction? Is one of my questions. This was a repeated theme that Radu brought out. And as he pointed out, there is overlapping jurisdiction if you look between the Byzantine Catholic churches and Latin churches in the Roman side. I think the more serious issue is having a regional Orthodox body that can make decisions for the region. To me, that's the primary thing. I think Radu pointed out what eventual unity would mean in terms of a united body of local bishops, including Catholic bishops and Byzantine Catholic and Orthodox together. But I think short of that, I'm less bothered by the fact that we would have a diversity. What I would look for would be a little more unity regionally among the Orthodox Orthodox themselves so that they could act united, and and I don't mind that they would overlap Catholic jurisdictions.
I try to use the existence of overlapping jurisdictions within Orthodoxy as a criterion for how much unity are we demanding between Orthodox and Catholics. Basically, do not postpone Eucharistic sharing before we solve the issue of overlapping jurisdictions. Here's one reason. In the Oriental Orthodox dialogue, we agreed that we have the same theological views. We use different terminology, but there are three issues that we still need to deal with. And one of them, the most important one, interestingly, besides the one of the calendar, because the ones we consider heretics are their confessors of faith, the one they consider heretics are our confessors of faith. But the most important one seems to be the overlapping jurisdictions, and it seems to me to be inconsistent. We should have officially this type of communion already, and there are some national churches that already recognize the relationship between Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox. Take that to the situation of Orthodoxy in America. It seems like in the Catholic Church, the overlapping jurisdictions do not stand in the way of local unity, the USCCB, let's say. However, and that's not a good example, USCCB, but within an American Catholicism, however, in the Orthodox Church, these overlapping jurisdictions mean that bishops who have their dioceses in the United States have their allegiance and responsibility towards synods outside of the United States. They are full voting members of synods in Bulgaria, Romania, Russia, and so forth. And so, because they're members in those synods, they cannot become members of a local American synod in a full sense American synod. And so these overlapping jurisdictions seem to have a little bit more of a disuniting role for us, as opposed to showing a diversity in terms of our cultural backgrounds, which would be very, very helpful. So I try to use it in a positive way, but that's the painful component in that regard. If I may ask you a question. You were talking about differences that are church dividing and differences that are not church dividing. And I personally am fully convinced that filioque, for example, is not a church dividing issue, like the consultation stated in 2003. At a certain point you said nothing needs to change in our traditions. And you said a few other things after that I missed it, but it prompted the question, is papal primacy or papal infallibility a church dividing issue?
Well, of course it is. When I said nothing needed to be changed, I was thinking of in terms of liturgical traditions, prayer traditions, languages, that kind of thing. Papal primacy is church dividing. Now, what I didn't talk about is what the dialogue said about it, which part of it sounds a lot like what you presented, in that the Pope would be first among equals. What's clear is that the universal jurisdiction, as it's now practiced by the Pope, could not possibly apply to the Orthodox in the same way that applies to the Latin Church today. And so at that point, you have to go back to Vatican I, which talked about universal jurisdiction. And universal jurisdiction in that sense, the context for that was partially the jurisdiction of the Pope vis-a-vis civil jurisdiction, because for a long time the church was under lay investiture and that kind of thing. And the other thing that current scholarship on Vatican I is pulling out is that the universal jurisdiction of the Pope does not sit out there by itself. It's within the context of his membership in the body of bishops, and his universal jurisdiction does not replace the jurisdiction of a bishop in his diocese. And so there's a conciliar and collegial context for that jurisdiction. Now that would need to be worked out, and in a sense, John Paul II called for our dialogue partners to help us think through what a renewed papacy would look like in the United Church. So we can't presume it would look exactly like it looks now.
Thank you very much, professors. At this point, we'd like to invite members of the audience. If you have a question, we will bring the microphone.
Use the mic somewhere, yes.
Just go up to the microphone. While people are lining up, there might be one or two people in the room for whom the phrase filioque, which involves the son, is maybe something that they are not familiar with or don't remember. And I wonder, Professor Wood, if you could give us the briefest of definitions of
Filioque is a Latin phrase which means "and from the Son," and it talks about Trinitarian procession. And the dispute is whether the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father through the Son, or from the Father and the Son. The Orthodox, when things got very heated, said that to say that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son is to say that the Spirit has two fathers.
Thank you so much. We'll begin over here.
Okay, question I have, I don't know if this is working.
It's not.
Okay, so I'll just say it. I was wondering about the idea of jurisdiction, if it were to ever happen, that there was a unity, that the Bishop of Rome would have this, would have, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll use this.
Please use the microphone.
So the question is, in a perfect world, if this were to happen where there was unity between the Roman Catholic and the basic Eastern Orthodox, could the diocese of the Bishop of Rome, which would really be a jurisdiction, kind of like the Serbian, Russian jurisdiction, the Greek jurisdiction, could it be a jurisdiction where it would still would have its own kind of integrity, but still be answerable to brother bishops, or, and especially patriarchs, brother patriarchs?
Well, one of the roles of the Roman primacy would be to help resolve disputes. Again, we'd have to see the principle of papal jurisdiction. I think we're using the word jurisdiction in two different ways. You're seeing it as a geographical area. When we talk about universal jurisdiction, it's not a polity that is governed, geographically as a section of the church, but we're saying the ability of the Pope to move into a diocese and make decisions there, perhaps over the residential bishop who's presiding there. And there are times in Roman Catholicism where that has happened, when Rome has determined that the diocese was not able to do it by itself, take care of its internal problems by itself. One example of that was when Bishop Worrell was sent into Bishop Hunthausen's diocese in Seattle. That's been almost 20 years ago now.
May I interrupt you for a second, Dr. Wood? What I'm talking about is more of a universal, general, big picture, not so much the diocese, the idea of diocese, because like in the OC, for example, we have tremendous numbers of dioceses and a lot of bishops, and they work things out. If there's a problem, they go to the metropolitan. If there's a problem beyond that, they go to the synod of bishops, and then they work it out, and they are the deciding factor.
Right.
But what I'm talking about is, because my understanding as an Orthodox Christian is that the primacy of the Pope of Rome, or the Patriarch of Rome, was to be able to call and officiate over meetings, especially ecumenical council meetings.
Right.
Among other things, it was a position of people were to honor that position because of Rome being what it was. Rome is the birthplace of Christianity. Well, besides Jerusalem, but as far as official goes. So the idea I thought was, I still am simplistic in my approach, is why can't we just make it work out with the Pope, if he would ever agree, to be brothers to all bishops, first among equals, and answerable to other people besides Christ. In other words, that's what it would mean. So forgive me, but I'm just wondering if you could respond to that.
I think that will have to be the last part of that question. Would you like to respond, both of you?
Well, it's a big question. First of all, yes, convening ecumenical councils, resolving disputes. What often gets pulled out in these conversations is Apostolic Constitution number 24, which the Orthodox say we would acknowledge a primacy of honor. But the question, and Brian Daly has written a very helpful article on this, saying that historically the primacy of honor had real decision-making abilities, that it wasn't just a deference given through that. I think what's driving a lot of this from the Orthodox side is fear. Fear of excessive papal action within the Orthodox churches.
Father Boriano, do you have a response?
Yes. I was suggesting during the paper that the Orthodox have to be willing to give the Pope universally the same authority that they give to a patriarch, let's say, within an autocephalous church. And as Dr. Wood mentioned, this is not just about honor in the sense that who sits at the head of the table, but it has to be a real ministry. He really is supposed to be able to convene councils. And in the West, we have a huge problem, namely Constantinople fell in 1453, and there are no more emperors to convene pan-Orthodox councils. Look at it, since the 1960s we've been trying to convene a pan-Orthodox council, and it hasn't worked. And right now we're worrying about pecking order, as you have, to borrow your expression. And so we could use somebody like a patriarch within a church, who can say, the Patriarch of Serbia can say, we're going to have a synod and we're going to discuss this issue, set the agenda, and work out the issues. But that's not only something that the Orthodox have to adapt to. Also in Roman Catholic ecclesiology, there have been some situations in the end of the 18th century that have been put into Pastor Eternus, which is the document of Vatican I that deals with this issue, and then taken up by Vatican II, that becomes a problem where the Pope has an immediate jurisdiction. And it's a technical term, by the way. I don't want to explain the whole thing right now. Full jurisdiction, again, a technical term over local bishops. And the Orthodox have perceived that as diminishing the authority of the local bishop. And if that is perceived as diminishing the authority of the local bishop, then it begs the question, how full is the local Orthodox Church? Or the local diocese, how full is the local diocese if some authority can come over it from the outside? So right now, I'm talking about two extremes, okay? But somewhere in the middle, something that we haven't arrived at that truth yet together. We're trying to bring together, and Dr. Wood was saying in her talk how Orthodoxy has this genius of synodality. And she was very gracious, but I would like to return the attitude and say that the Catholics have this genius of unity. And so how can we try to bring these two together and work out? That would have significant consequences upon Orthodoxy in America. That's what we're trying to establish right now.
Thank you so much. If you could, I think you will be next, and if I could ask you in the interest of time to ask your question as concisely as possible so the professors will have time to
Certainly. Appreciate both Father Radu and Professor Wood have said about universality. Let me get to a little question about something a little more simpler than that. How about the Eastern and Western Holy Weeks or Easters coming together? That would be a very good item to work with.
Sir, if you are an Orthodox, don't you really enjoy getting things on sale?
Any other responses?
The North American Orthodox Catholic consultation At the same time, we released this vision statement, released a statement on Easter and suggested that we go back to Nicaea in its computation of that.
If I may add, because I'm really upset with this issue, when you said we go back to Nicaea, I really hear you saying we, both of us.
Right.
Both of us. And I'm upset as an Orthodox with the Orthodox, because I don't know if everybody knows. At Nicaea, it was decided, at the Council of Nicaea in 325, there were many ways to calculate Easter, and so they got together and they said, let's not wait for letters to come from a central place to calculate Easter. All of you should just know when the spring vernacular is. Just look at the stars and the moon length of day, let's figure that out. And then take the first Sunday after the full moon, after the vernacular. And that's what Protestant and Catholic churches are using today. There was also another stipulation that it should not coincide or precede the Jewish Passover. And that's something that was dropped from the Protestant and Catholic calculation of Easter, but for us Orthodox is very important. However, we Orthodox, instead of looking at the length of days, we're actually looking at old ways of calculating the spring vernacular. And that's 13 days backwards because of the difference between the new and old calendar. And instead of respecting the decision of an ecumenical council that had nothing to do with the calendar, we're faithful, quote unquote, to these Paschalia. These are the dates of Easter that were set based on a different understanding of when the spring vernacular is. And so I'm all for just saying second week in April.
Thank you so much. If you have a question over here, it would be nice time.
A lot of our ecumenical efforts are progressive and are oriented toward overcoming the primary obstacles. But I'm wondering about tangential, counterintuitive approaches. I think of, for example, certain of the more pragmatic developments, sociologically speaking, in regards to the world of technology, that you have a process of leapfrogging, as an example, where people who are used to cassette players, we call them Luddites, they don't even bother with CDs and DVDs, they jumped up to digital. So I'm thinking maybe we have a little bit of a leapfrog here to help you to that Ecumenical Institute. Are there some other of those things that they might not be the normal steps that we would think of intuitively, but they can make a big difference?
There was, in the beginning of the 20th century, for example, in England, a fellowship, and we were talking about this this morning with some of the colloquists, the fellowship of St. Sergius and St. Alban. These were Anglicans and Orthodox that got together. Initially they had some other Christians, but then it became Orthodox Anglican. And the members of this fellowship got together and they discussed theological issues. And they came to the conclusion that they are so united in their faith that no Orthodox parish really shares in that type of unity because people don't discuss about their faith. They just assume in that Orthodox parish. And no Anglican parish shares in that much unity as, because they don't discuss these things or they don't know, as the members of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. They looked for episcopal blessings. I don't know if they got it or not, but they started receiving communion together at a certain point. It was very briefly lived, and now we're back to not receiving communion together. Is that the leapfrogging that you have mentioned, or it went way up?
Well, it might be a leapfrogging back. So,
well, it went up for a second there.
Other responses to this question? Next question.
The talks seem to emphasize process, procedure, even heresy, that kind of thing. And I'm concerned because Vatican II told us that we are the people of God, and that is the church. And it strikes me that the tone and tenor of conversations, and I've been to all the symposiums, not all of them were this way, but that they're concerned more about process, procedure, and heresy. And Ut Unum Sint in 1995 said, and throughout, that love is what we should be doing with each other with respect to how we're going to gain rapprochement, how we're going to integrate, interface. And I'm kind of wondering why we don't emphasize that instead of the power of the bishops over us, because ironically, if you really examined the thought process of us laymen, you'd find out that all of us are heretics. And there's a lot of views that we do not accept, such as the power of the bishops in the way that they react to us.
Okay, what you're referring to is very, very important, and it's what the Decree on Ecumenism and Ut Unum Sint refer to as spiritual ecumenism, which goes back to that, unity is not possible without conversion, and that conversion is both personal, but I would also say conversion is also communal, and involves a change in our way of approaching our dialogue partner. I think the fact that we haven't talked about spiritual ecumenism is not diminishing its importance. I think the theme of this conference, in terms of canon orthodoxy in America, has invited us to look at more structural topics.
What will be our last question?
Father, thank you for addressing the calendar issue. I recently gave a presentation on inter-Orthodox relations, and I was specifically told that this is too emotional an issue, and I wasn't allowed to include the calendar in that presentation. But on a local level, I see it as something that divides us. We can come together during the seasons of Lent and Easter, but during the seasons of Christmas and Epiphany, we're divided and can't find a common ground between those of us in different jurisdictions. So I think it's an important issue. On Dr. Wood's presentation, my husband and I are in a military ministry situation. He's an Orthodox chaplain serving in the U.S. military, and we often think of the military as a microcosm of the U.S. We see in the military that the Byzantine Catholics that come in, those that serve as priests are not allowed to serve in the Byzantine tradition. They must serve in the Roman tradition. And on that same note, those Orthodox priests that come in that are coming from the Western Rite tradition that does exist within the Orthodox Church here in America must serve in the Eastern tradition. So there is sort of a separation of rights there. My concern is, and seeing how we assign those who serve our men and women, and understanding fully the thing that says that you can give us communion, but we don't give you communion. The Catholic, how do we change the hearts and minds of those on the ground? Because we recently saw the implementation of a revised liturgy. That's met with a lot of pushback. So how can we change the hearts and minds of the men and women that are not clergy, don't have a theological background, and don't understand these issues that divide us?
I think that's a very thoughtful question and probably a very nuanced question. If we could give a brief response, which we might elaborate on over lunch.
I heard 3 questions. The first one was about the military, and I think that's a military problem, not a church problem. I think it has to do with a limited number of ministers, and I think that's probably what's driving that polity. The last question is how do my question to the Orthodox is, what are the things that have to be sorted out, and and what agreement do we have to come to, and what acknowledgments do Orthodoxy have to make about Catholicism to make occasional sharing in times of necessity, which is basically what the ecumenical directory guidelines are governing, possible. And that isn't just in the minds and hearts of individual Orthodox. That's a higher level in terms of polity. And I don't know the answer to that.
Well, while you were speaking, a thought that came during Dr. Wood's presentation came back to my mind, and that was the one about the limited sacramental liturgical sharing. And I wanted to commend the commission of which you are part for previous statements on weddings, baptisms, including full recognition of baptism. In terms of wedding, I was reading those statements and I couldn't believe it. You're supposed to have a wedding between an Orthodox and a Catholic in either one of the churches. It's supposed to be written in both registries, and it comes pretty close to concelebration of that sacrament. And so, of course, it begs the question, what is happening there? Because as a priest in a parish, believe me, I married a lot of Orthodox to a lot of Catholics. There is sacramental sharing there. And you are telling us about explaining those differences to the people in the pews. I'm going to say, could you please explain that to us? Let it go the other way. I quoted Tertullian before, where it says that the bishop is in the church and the church is in the bishop. How? How, if I can marry an Orthodox and a Catholic, but I cannot serve with the Catholic priest at that wedding? And so it is an unnatural situation. There is a certain separation between the reality that is being confessed at the grassroots level and at other levels. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of these divisions, though, because if we are a church and Orthodox and Catholics agree that the church is clergy and the people together, with Jesus Christ being the head, then we need to solve these differences at all levels. And so these divisions are real, even though they are not equally felt everywhere. Sometimes they're not equally felt everywhere because we're not practically impacted, sometimes because of a lack of education. But the truth is, there are divisions not only among Orthodox and Catholics, but within Catholicism, within Orthodoxy, and we need to deal with these issues. And many of these issues actually are local in character. You're talking about the calendar. I talked to a Serbian priest who said, we will never celebrate Christmas with the Croats.
On that?
Okay. And they will not get married to each other, right? But that's not discrimination in the United States.
I think in both of our cultures, there's a rule: don't interrupt a priest. So I do apologize. I have, or a professor. I have the sad duty to end this very vigorous and wonderfully argued session. It's obvious that both of our professors have more to say on these topics, and you have more questions to ask. So this is but a respite, but an interruption of a dialogue that I know will continue for the next day as well as all afternoon. So I thank you so much for your attention.